So I entitled this Opportunity and Adversity in Becoming a Native Listener to focus my attention on the parts of my work that address the themes of this meeting. And I want to say also at the outset how much you'll see that I do the work that I do, and you'll see, anybody who knows what I do will see very familiar research presented, but you'll see that it's also, I'm asking a lot of new questions with it that have been, my movement to these kinds of new questions has been hugely influenced by my participation in the CFAR network. Okay, language acquisition is one of our crowning achievements. I like to think of language as one of the quintessential features, characteristics, capabilities of our species, and the acquisition of the native language begins very early. You can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Barely. Maybe he can turn that up? Is this better? Yes. Is that too loud? No. Okay. My voice has gotten softer. So we'll start over again. Language is one of our crowning characteristics as a species, and the acquisition of language begins, the acquisition of the native language begins as early as we can measure it. So here you see a newborn infant with her mother, and the mother is talking to the infant is watching, she's receiving speech from the moment she's born. We'll hear before as well. She's watching her mother's face. She's picking up characteristics of the visual, of the movements in the face that accompany speech, and she's receiving all of this in an incredibly supportive emotional context. So input is driving acquisition of the native language from the beginning of life, and it's through the perceptual systems that we first learn about the properties of the native language and use those to launch into acquisition more generally. But of course, language acquisition also requires biological preparedness. So even though Jujube is getting just as much language as James here, Jujube hasn't advanced very far. And indeed, there is neural specialization for speech at birth. So since 2002, we've known from the work of Marcela Pina that the brain responds differently to forward versus backward speech, even in a newborn infant. But more recently, we've shown in my lab that even this has an experiential basis in prenatal development. So the differential response to forward versus backward speech is seen really only for the native language. The brain treats both forward and backwards unfamiliar speech as language-like. And similarly, at birth, we have a preference for listening to speech over non-speech. So when given the opportunity to suck on a pacifier in order to hear this versus this, a newborn infant will choose to suck more to hear speech. However, at birth, it isn't a very specific preference, and the newborn infant will also suck more to hear a rhesus monkey call over sine wave analogs to speech. Only by 3 months of age or so does this become more specific, in which it's just to human speech and not to other kinds of primate vocalizations. It's Athena Vouloumanis' work. And tuning to different properties of the native language then continues at different ages. So we have this biological preparation. We show a differential response to speech versus non-speech, but it's already showing some tuning very early in life. As we develop, we tune to the properties of more advanced properties of the native language versus unfamiliar languages, the vowel categories, the consonant categories, etc. And these work together, I'll show you very briefly at the end, in a cascading model to help move us into acquisition of the native language, to pull out words, attach them to meaning, learn the syntax, etc. And one of the questions that's sort of the holy grail in language acquisition is, are there critical or sensitive periods in acquisition, and how set are they? So some work from Marcela Pina's lab would asked whether they're maturationally based. So after just listening to Takao's talk, and clearly this figure is from his work, one might think that some of these would be maturationally based and perhaps others not. So what Marcela Pina and her colleagues did is they tested babies who were either full term or born up to 3 months preterm on the timing of their sensitivity to a specific property that distinguishes similar languages, rhythmical characteristics. And this is something that typically tunes by around 4 to 5 months of age. And they asked whether it was driven by gestational age, which would be maturation, or whether it was driven by postnatal listening experience to the native language. And what they found in this study is that it was driven by maturational age, not postnatal listening experience. So this seems to be a sensitive period that is maturational. It comes online at a point in development independent of the amount of postnatal listening experience. However, as you heard in Takao's talk, there are some critical periods in the visual system that can be changed not just by drugs or genetic knockouts, but by experiential conditions such as dark rearing. So one of the questions that we've been interested in is, are there experiential influences on the timing of these sensitive periods? Can we move them around, or do they move around as a function of the type of environments that infants find themselves in? So that's just, can the timing of different critical periods be changed, and does it have consequences for later language acquisition? Every child has what we would consider both opportunity and adversity in their growing up, as Tom pointed out in his talk. And this is in part because of this complex interplay between nature and nurture that our network focuses on. We don't start with just biology or the environment. As soon as we can measure biology, it's already been shaped in part by the environment, and as soon as we can measure environmental influences, they've already been selected in part by the biology. And these, as we know, transact together across development. And what's opportunity for one child may be adversity for another, depending upon this complex interplay between nature and nurture. But nonetheless, we have to try to make a stab at understanding how different environments might work and which ones might be opportunity for any particular child, and which ones might be adversity, and in a mechanistic type way from the kind of work that Takao and others are doing, whether we can then intervene. So I'm going to be looking at two types of opportunity and adversity, bilingualism and exposure to maternal depression and or antidepressants, and using two tasks as assays. And these are tasks that are part of the cascade of tuning to the native language across the first year of life: phonetic discrimination and visual language discrimination. So phonetic discrimination, something I've been working on for a long time, now recharacterized as perceptual narrowing. Thanks, Chuck Nelson. The idea is that when we're born, we're able to discriminate a lot more sound contrast than we might need in the language that we're growing up in. So for example, English has 6 stop consonants: ba, da, ga, pa, ta, ka. A language like Hindi has 16 stop consonants. So there are distinctions in there that we as English speakers don't use. And I'll just play you one of them, maybe. Da, da, da. Okay, so those are da to you. But to a Hindi speaker, they're as different as ba and da. And it turns out that to a young English learning infant, they're also as different as ba and da. So at 6 months of age, an English learning infant is as able to discriminate that, as they are ba from da. By the time that they're 10 to 12 months of age, they're not doing well at all, however, unless they're growing up in a language like Hindi where it's used. So this is an example of the perceptual system being prepared early in life to learn the sound system of any of the world's languages. And what the input does is it narrows sensitivity to be specific to the language that the child's hearing. And it's not just losing sensitivities or declining in sensitivity to non-native contrasts. There's also a lot of evidence now that, of course, you sharpen your native categories as well. So it's both of those. The other phenomenon, and this has been replicated many times with many contrasts using a lot of behavioral techniques as well as electrophysiological techniques. The other phenomenon that I want to use as an assay is visual language discrimination. And here again, we have perceptual narrowing. So what we did in this study is we asked whether babies could use cues in talking faces to discriminate one language from another. This came from, it was one of my first trips to Japan. I was in a noisy train station. The signs were all in Japanese. I was hopelessly lost. I didn't know, what I should do, and so I was looking around the crowd for somebody who might speak English. I couldn't hear voices over the cacophony, and all the faces were Japanese. And so I was desperately trying to find somebody in the crowd who might speak English. And you find yourself looking for visual cues in talking faces. So the question we asked is this a cue that babies can use to distinguish one possible language from another? And this was actually Nuria Sebastian Gallus was thinking the same things. So this is a study that we came up with together. Whitney Wykeham was a PhD student who really turned this into something along with Athena Voulimanis. So the way you do this task is you habituate babies, you show them we showed them 3 different bilingual speakers, one at a time, over and over again, reciting sentences in one language. And they saw those until they got bored, so their looking time declined to a criterial amount. And we said they had habituated. And in the experimental groups, they were now showing the same speakers producing yet new sentences in in a different language. The control group got the same language. So you first saw Julie speaking English, and now she's speaking French. And we asked whether babies could discriminate that change. And what we found is that at 4 and 6 months of age, English monolingual learning infants could discriminate the change from English to French or vice versa. Of course, it was counterbalanced. But by 8 months of age, they were no longer doing so. So this is some tuning that seems to happen by around 8 months of age. It's sensitivity to cues in talking faces, and I can talk to you about what we think they are at the end of the talk if you want, that's there in the young infant and is no longer maintained in a monolingual infant by 8 months of age. Okay, so these are our 2 tasks that will be the assays of the environmental effects of different types of opportunity and adversity. So the first one is bilingual first language acquisition. So these are kids who are growing up with 2 languages from birth. Clarissa is growing up bilingual with Spanish and English. Her mother speaks Spanish and English. Her father speaks really just Spanish. You should hear his English. So, and we tested children we and other people, Laura Bosk and Nuria Sebastian Gallus did the first work on bilingual speech perception. First of all, on different types of speech sound contrasts, phonetic discriminations, consonant distinctions, vowel distinctions. And what's been found now across about a dozen studies is that by 10 to 12 months of age, babies who are growing up bilingual maintain the distinctions used in each of their native languages. So this, in some ways, is an opportunity that they now have a phonetic repertoire that's richer than a monolingual child has. They have the distinctions of each of their native languages. The data are inconsistent, but there's also some evidence in there that this might take a little bit longer to get established in the bilingual. And if you think about it, there is less input in each language for the bilingual child. So it wouldn't be a surprise that it would take a little bit longer. It doesn't take a lot longer, just a little bit, but the input does play a role. And if Anne Fernald were here today, she'd be talking about some wonderful work on the role of the input in both monolingual and monolingual children, and how the amount of input does have processing consequences. But here then, bilingual babies, by the end, by 10 to 12 months, are maintaining the distinctions used in each of their native languages. And similarly, we asked about discrimination in babies who are growing up bilingual. So I had shown you the results with monolingual babies, that they can discriminate the change from English to French in talking faces at 4 and 6, but not at 8 months of age. But if we bring, that's the monolingual babies at 8 months of age, if we bring bilingual French-English babies into the lab, they're still able to discriminate the change from English to French at 8 months of age. And this may be one of the cues that they use to figure out, hey, what's mom talking now? Now, it turns out in some more recent work that Nuri Sebastian Gallas and I have completed that this is a sensitivity that's maintained even for unfamiliar native languages. So babies who are growing up bilingual with Spanish and Catalan are also able to continue to pay attention to that distinction in that between English and French, visual English and French. So it seems this bilingual experience seems to tune not just sensitivity to the specific properties that the babies are experiencing, but it also seems to be tuning the attentional system to cues that might distinguish one language from another. This is an opportunity. It helps them with what they need, but it may have other processing consequences. The fact that they're paying attention to this could have other processing consequences. Okay. The other kind of experience that babies have, way too many babies have, is that they're born into, or actually even gestated in an environment of maternal depression. And so like 10 to 13% of mothers are depressed during their pregnancies, and some of these mothers choose to have antidepressant treatment. So in this set of studies, we're looking at the role, the effect of exposure to depression and or antidepressants on timing, again, of these two. I'm using these two assays to see whether an environment like depression or drug exposure could affect something as specific as the timing of changes in speech sound discrimination and or visual language discrimination. We know that there are correlations between maternal depression and poor developmental outcome, including in language and communication skills, but we don't know what the root is, what are the contributing factors to those delays. So this can help with that work. Now, this work was not just my idea. This is work that Takal Hinch and I originally conceived to test the role of benzodiazepines as a GABA mediator on the inhibitory-excitatory balance. We would have a mechanistic explanation for any kind of drug exposure that we found. But in the time from when we conceived the grant to getting the funding, best practices changed, and depressed moms were no longer given benzodiazepines. They were given pretty much exclusively SSRIs or SRIs, serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And so, which are also perhaps have an effect on excitatory inhibitory balance, but it's a much more indirect route. It wasn't the specific route we wanted to study. We teamed up with Tim Oberlander, who's a developmental pediatrician at UBC, who does work on state regulation, maternal depression, its effect on the HPA axis, looks at different alleles of the serotonin transporter gene, and has a wonderful lab where he brings in moms from, he identifies mothers who are depressed in the second trimester of pregnancy and follows them through their pregnancies into postnatal development. And he joined with this team and allowed us to put our study on top of his study so that we could test the babies. And Whitney Wykeham is the postdoc who really drove this research. Okay. Now, SRIs, as I've mentioned, have many consequences on child outcome. But there's a recent study that came out just recently in PNAS that shows that they affect the perceptual systems quite specifically as well. So circuitry, in addition, they even affect tonotopic organization in the primary auditory cortex. There's a possibility then that they will change the they do change the wiring in the brain in rats, and they also make rats more neophobic and anxious. So both specific tuning of the sensory systems as well as broader perceptual tuning. And maternal depression, as I mentioned, has consequences for language and learning. And some of the mediating factors might be that depressed moms use less infant-directed speech. These have all been shown to be true. They are less likely to label objects to their children. They engage in less joint attention, less symbolic play. So we asked, so this is with Takao Hinch, Tim Oberlander, and Whitney Wycombe, whether exposure to SRIs and or maternal depression impact the timing of change on these two tasks. And first, the speech perception task and the visual language task. And first, I'll just talk about babies between 6 and 10 months of age. So if you remember, in our typically developing infants, at 6 months, a monolingual infant can discriminate the Hindi, retroflex dental, da-da distinction, and can discriminate visual English from visual French. So we asked here, we looked at 3 groups of infants whose mothers were either non-depressed, non-treated, so normal moms who were depressed, well, they're all normal moms. These are depressed moms who chose not to be treated is group 2, and group 3 is depressed moms who were given, who had selected to have SRI treatment. What we found is that in our control group, as we expected, although we used a slightly different behavioral paradigm, at 6 months of age they discriminated the native distinction, and at 10 months of age they didn't. So that's the pattern that one would expect. In our depressed non-treated, these were the babies, I'm sorry. So we're now testing the babies of these moms at 6 and 10 months. The babies of the depressed non-treated moms didn't show any evidence of discrimination at 6 months, which was surprising, but were discriminating the distinction still at 10 months of age. So we can draw 2 conclusions from this. First of all, they are maintaining sensitivity beyond an age that they should. Why they failed at 6 months, we don't know, but we think this might have to do more with sort of the neophobic and anxiety aspects of exposure to, well, that was to SRIs, but to just, we don't really know why they're not performing well. We think it might be, there might be a kind of learned helplessness. There's almost evidence of a familiarity over novelty preference there, and with a bigger N, that might be in place. So it could be that they're discriminating, but they're showing a different kind of pattern. But what is clear is that they're still continuing to discriminate beyond the age that they should. So we seem to have a delay in plasticity. And then our SRI-exposed infants are failing to discriminate at both ages. So this could be for 2 reasons. One could be that that exposure to SRIs has simply interfered with, interfered with the ability to perform in the task, or it could be that the critical period has been moved earlier. In the visual language task, we have exactly the same results. So our control group discriminates at 6 months, but not at 10 months. That's in blue. Our depressed exposure to depression group doesn't discriminate at 6 months, but does at 10 months. And our SRI-exposed infants were not discriminating the language change at either age. So by 10 months then, I've just explained this. We have typical pattern in the control group, an apparent delay in maintenance of plasticity longer than one would expect in the depressed groups, and we don't know what's going on in the SRI group. We didn't know whether it was that they couldn't do the task or whether the critical period had been moved earlier. So to address that question, we decided to test babies, to look at the data from babies at a younger age. So we looked at the data from these same infants at 36 weeks gestation. And it's been reported in the literature that fetuses at this age can discriminate vowels, but there are no reports of consonant discrimination until full term, till 40 weeks. And indeed, there are reports of failures for minimal pair consonant discrimination before 40 weeks gestation. So we decided to test both. And we decided that if SRI exposure interferes with processing, SRI-exposed fetuses, I should say fetuses, should fail to discriminate the vowels at 36 weeks if they just can't discriminate because of the SRI exposure and perhaps its effect on tonotopic organization. On the other hand, if SRI exposure accelerates the timing of plasticity, the fetuses but not control fetuses should discriminate the consonant distinctions. The exposed fetuses but not the control fetuses should discriminate the consonant distinctions at 36 weeks gestation. So the method, only about 3 minutes away, the method is that we played a speech sound distinction, a different one that was likely to be heard in utero, a voicing distinction, ta-da, to pregnant mothers. We put speakers right next to their abdomen, and we recorded the fetal heart rate. We would present a sound like ta, ta, ta for 30 seconds and then change to da. And we recorded the fetal heart rate for 10 seconds. We measured it before and after the change, and if they can discriminate, one would expect a deceleration in heart rate on the basis of previous data. And what we found is that replicating the previous work, both the non-exposed fetuses at 36 weeks did indeed discriminate the vowel change, that was A-E, and SRI-exposed fetuses also discriminated it. So discrimination seems to be intact. But when we looked at the consonants, we see that the non-exposed, again, replicating previous work, failed to discriminate the consonant distinction at 36 weeks gestation, whereas the SRI-exposed fetuses did. So on the basis of these data, we concluded that SRI exposure does accelerate the onset of consonant discrimination, and that could be why, and they failed at 6 and 10 months of age on the Hindi contrast, is that the whole period of sensitivity had been moved forward. They were discriminating too early and perhaps then retuning their categories earlier as well. And acceleration may or may not be advantageous. Changes in performance, as I mentioned earlier, on one task impact later language skills. There's really lovely work from Pat Kuhl's lab that shows that the quality of native discrimination, discriminating native consonants, well, at like 8 months, predicts better language skills from 14 to 30 months of age, whereas better discrimination of a non-native contrast is correlated with worse language outcomes. And one of the reasons is we've shown in a number of studies that babies use the speech sound distinctions that they establish in the first year of life to guide word learning. So if you're growing up in a language like English and somebody says dog and dog, that should mean the same thing. If you're growing up in Hindi, it should mean two different things. And similarly here in Dutch, if you're growing up with Dutch, tam and tam can actually mean different things because vowel length is distinctive. So the speech sound categories established in the first year do guide later language. So a change in timing, if your categories are established too early when you haven't had enough input, you could have sloppy categories that are not so useful when you go on to word learning. And similarly, if you're bilingual, maybe it's advantageous to take a little bit longer to establish those categories given that you've been getting less input. So this kind of research then, understanding the steps in development, looking at specific aspects of language acquisition, not just language acquisition in general, and how they change as a function of different environments, can help us be in a position to turn adversity into opportunity. So thank you to my collaborators on this work, my lab, and the funders.